everyone, and welcome. We're diving into a topic you wanted to explore, ophthalmoplegia.
That's a good one.
It is. Now, it might sound a little intimidating, but basically it's all about conditions that affect how your eyes move. And while that might seem pretty straightforward, there's actually a lot more to uncover.
Absolutely. It's not just about the eye movements themselves.
Right. It can be a sign of something else going on.
Yeah, ophthalmoplegia can sometimes be a clue to other health conditions. It's important to see it in that bigger context.
Like a warning light.
Exactly.
So let's dive into that. What are some of the things that someone might notice if they were experiencing ophthalmoplegia? What would be some of those initial signs?
Well, it can be tricky, especially with kids, because, children are amazingly adaptable. They might not even realize anything is wrong.
Oh, interesting.
They just kind of adjust. So regular eye exams are so important.
Makes sense to catch it early. Now, we've thrown around this term ophthalmoplegia, but I know from the research that there are different types. Can you break those down for us a little bit?
Absolutely. So we can think about it in two main categories: internal and external ophthalmoplegia. Internal affects the muscles inside your eye. So these are the muscles that control your pupil, how it focuses.
Like the mechanics of the eye, kind of.
Exactly. And then external ophthalmoplegia affects those muscles that surround the eye, so the ones that let us look up, down, side to side.
Gotcha. So very different actions then. So it sounds like diagnosing this could be tricky. I mean, how do doctors pinpoint what type of ophthalmoplegia someone has and what's causing it?
It's a bit of detective work for sure. It usually starts with a physical exam.
So just looking at the eyes.
Well, assessing eye movement, checking for things like double vision, difficulty tracking objects, drooping eyelids, things like that.
Okay, so really observing those movements.
Right. But sometimes we need to go deeper.
And that's where the imaging comes in.
Exactly. An MRI or CT scan can be incredibly helpful.
To actually see the muscles themselves.
Yeah, it allows us to see the muscles, the nerves, look for any abnormalities, and then blood tests can also be part of the equation.
To rule out or identify any underlying conditions. So treatment really depends on what they find, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
You got it. Treatment is tailored to the individual and the root cause.
So, for example, what would be different for someone who has ophthalmoplegia because of migraines versus, say, a different underlying cause?
Well, if migraines are the culprit, managing those migraines effectively might be enough to alleviate the eye symptoms as well.
Interesting. So sometimes it's not even directly treating the eye muscles themselves.
Exactly. Other times we might use things like special glasses or prisms to help correct double vision, or even eye patches in some cases.
It really is a puzzle, isn't it, putting all those pieces together? And speaking of putting pieces together, one thing that we found in our research that we thought was really interesting was the connection between ophthalmoplegia and diabetes.
Oh, absolutely.
Particularly for men over 45 with a history of type 2 diabetes. Could you explain that connection a little bit? What's going on there?
Sure. High blood sugar, which is a hallmark of diabetes, can damage those tiny blood vessels over time. And this damage can affect blood vessels anywhere in the body.
Including the ones that supply the nerves that control our eye movements.
Exactly.
So those tiny little vessels are so important.
Absolutely.
Wow. It really makes you think about those everyday habits and how they affect our health. Have you noticed any changes in your vision? This might be a good thing to bring up with your doctor at your next checkup. Now, besides diabetes, we also came across some other conditions in our research like multiple sclerosis, also known as MS, and Graves' disease, and they were listed as potential risk factors for ophthalmoplegia. Can you help us understand that connection? Because I'll be honest, I don't immediately see the link between those conditions and muscle control in the eyes.
Yeah, it's a good question. Both MS and Graves' disease are autoimmune conditions.
And just as a reminder for our listeners, what does that mean again?
It means that the body is essentially attacking itself. In the case of MS, the immune system targets this protective covering that surrounds our nerve fibers, kind of like insulation.
So those messages aren't getting through as clearly.
Exactly. It interrupts those signals from the brain to the muscles, and that includes those that control eye movement. Now, Graves' disease is a little bit different.
Okay.
It affects the thyroid gland, causing it to kind of go into overdrive.
So it's producing too much of the thyroid hormone?
Exactly. And these hormones can actually target the muscles around the eyes.
Oh, wow.
This can cause the eyes to bulge or become misaligned, which then leads to ophthalmoplegia.
So it's like this chain reaction.
Uh,
It's fascinating how these seemingly disparate conditions can all kind of converge on this one area of eye movement. Speaking of specific types of ophthalmoplegia, I was really struck by a term that we saw in the research, chronic progressive external ophthalmoplegia. It even has its own acronym, CPEO.
It does sound a little intimidating, doesn't
It
it?
does. So, what makes CPEO different from other types of ophthalmoplegia? What are the challenges specifically associated with it?
CPO is particularly interesting because it's often caused by a genetic mutation,
Okay.
which means it's present from birth, but might not actually show up until someone's a bit older, usually between 18 and 40.
Wow. So it can be dormant for a long time.
Exactly. And what distinguishes CPEO is its progressive nature. The muscle weakness tends to get worse over time.
So it's not a static condition, it actually changes over time.
Right. And it can start to affect other muscles beyond just the eye movement.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in more advanced cases, people with CPEO can actually have difficulty swallowing.
Wow, that sounds intense.
Can be. The medical term for that is dysphagia. And in some cases, CPEO can even lead to muscle weakness in other parts of the body, particularly in the limbs. And this weakness might become especially noticeable after exercise.
So it really does highlight how interconnected our bodies are.
It does.
I mean, we started out talking about eye muscles, and now we're talking about swallowing and limb weakness. It's incredible.
Yeah. And it just goes to show that something that might seem isolated can actually have far-reaching effects.
Absolutely. So for someone with CPEO, what are some of the things that, they're facing on a daily basis? What are some of the challenges?
Well, it really depends on the individual and how severe their symptoms are, how quickly it's progressing. But it often involves finding ways to adapt.
To maintain a good quality of life.
Exactly.
This is making me realize I really do take my eye health for granted.
It's easy to do. Our eyes, they just work most of the time.
Right, until they don't, and then you realize how much you rely on them. Okay, so we've talked about CPEO, but that's not the only specific type of ophthalmoplegia that we came across in the research. We also saw some information about something called internuclear ophthalmoplegia. Did I say that right?
You did.
It's a mouthful.
It is.
And this one was often linked to multiple sclerosis. Is that right?
That's right. It's frequently associated with MS, although there can be other causes too.
Okay, so can you talk us through that connection a little bit? What's going on there?
So, to understand internuclear ophthalmoplegia, we need to talk about how our brains communicate with our eye muscles. There's this specific pathway, almost like a cable, that connects the control center in your brain to the muscles that control your eye movements.
Oh.
And this pathway is called the medial longitudinal fasciculus, or MLF for short.
The MLS, okay.
The MLF.
Yeah.
And you can think of this pathway as being responsible for the smooth, coordinated movements of your eyes.
Like when we're reading, for example.
Exactly, your eyes moving together across the page. That's the MLF in action. But now remember how we were talking earlier about multiple sclerosis and how it can damage that protective covering around nerve fibers?
Yeah, the insulation.
Right, like the insulation. Well, if that damage occurs in the MLF, it can disrupt the smooth transmission of signals from the brain to the eye muscles. And that's what can lead to internuclear ophthalmoplegia.
So the eye muscles themselves aren't necessarily weak,
No, they're capable of moving.
but they're not getting the right signals.
Exactly. They're not getting those clear instructions because of the damage to that pathway.
Interesting. And you mentioned that while MS is a common cause, it's not the only one.
Right. Anything else that affects the MLF can also lead to internuclear ophthalmoplegia.
So that could be things like infections.
Infections, strokes, sometimes even tumors.
It really highlights the complexity of what seems like a very specific condition. It's incredible when you really think about it. I mean, we do so much with our eyes, and it's easy to just take that for granted.
Absolutely. We don't realize how much we rely on these complex mechanisms until something goes wrong.
Exactly. And I think this whole deep dive into ophthalmoplegia has really highlighted that, eye health isn't just about how clearly we see.
It's true. It can be a window into our overall health.
It's all connected. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners walk away with today?
Well, if there's one thing I want to emphasize, it's this. Listen to your body. If you're noticing any changes in your vision, no matter how small they might seem, don't brush them off.
Right, don't just ignore them.
Exactly. Make an appointment with your eye doctor or your primary care physician. Talk to them about what you're experiencing. Early detection is key.
Like we were talking about earlier, it's that warning light on the dashboard.
Exactly. And remember, taking care of your overall health is also crucial for maintaining good eye health. Managing those chronic conditions like diabetes, eating a healthy diet, not smoking, these things all contribute.
It all comes back to those interconnected systems.
It really does.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful, and I, for one, will be making an appointment with my eye doctor very soon.
I'm glad to hear it.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for being here. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a new fascinating topic. Until then, take care.